So hello everyone, my name's Eleanor. I'm the Education Manager at Benjamin Franklin House, and I'm really delighted to welcome you today to this, our first in this series of live history classes that are going to be all about the Georgians, and this one's about kings and queens. So before we get started, just a couple of kind of housekeeping points about how you can participate today. It's great to already see some of your comments, your hellos, and I'm sure you may have some questions as we go through, and I'm going to be asking you some questions too. So the main ways that you can participate in the class are by using your raise hand button. And if you press that, then I can unmute your microphone and you can ask a question over the audio. And the other way is using the chat function, which I can see lots of people using already. And there's also the Q&A as well, but in previous classes, people have tended to prefer using the chat, but you can use all three of those ways to get involved today. As I mentioned, we are recording today's class, and we will put a recording on our website and our YouTube channel. That will be up by tomorrow. So if you're actually watching this after it's been recorded, then you can always get in touch with any questions at education@benjaminfranklinhouse.org. Series for us, these history classes, and they're going to be taking place every second and fourth Sunday of the month. Sorry, not Sunday, Thursday. It's a Thursday today at 3 p.m. GMT. And so when we're thinking about history, you may have noticed that the word history contains the word story in it. And so that's a really important part of history. We're going to be, and over these weeks, we're going to be uncovering the story of the Georgian period in Britain. So that will be some of the key characters, key events that happened, and also what it was like to live in Britain at that time. But another really important part of being a historian is developing certain skills that you need to be able to find out about the past. So that's something else we're going to be looking at in the classes as well. So to be a good historian, you need that knowledge that comes from knowing the story and uncovering the story. But in order to get there, you also need some important skills. I like to think of them as being a bit like detective skills to really uncover the past. So before we take a closer look at these kings and queens that I can tell lots of you know lots about already, we're going to circle back to Ian's question, which is what this all has to do with Benjamin Franklin. So let's have a look at Benjamin Franklin. So on the left, you can see a lovely illustration of Benjamin Franklin. This shows him on Craven Street in the house, which we now call Benjamin Franklin House, which you can see on the right. And before I tell you a bit more about Benjamin Franklin and the house he lived in that we now have open as a museum, and we run these classes through, I'd like to just see if anyone who's joined us today would like to share things they know about Benjamin Franklin, maybe why he was in London, what he was doing at this house on Craven Street. So I can see a raised hand from Enid, and I'll be checking the chat as well. Let's see what Enid can tell us. Hi, Enid.
Hi. He was there because he was the ambassador of England.
What was that? Sorry, Enid?
He was the ambassador to England.
Right, okay. So he was, because at that time when Benjamin Franklin came to London, America was actually still part of England. He wasn't officially an ambassador, but he was like a diplomat. He was here for politics. Very good, thank you so much. And I saw in the chat someone mentioned that he invented the glass harmonica, that he's American, Stella says, just like me. That's great. And also that he was one of the founding fathers. So clearly you know lots of things already. That's fantastic. Okay, so I'll just do a bit of an overview of Benjamin Franklin's life, explain a bit more what Enid said about him coming to London, and a bit more about his house as well. So Benjamin Franklin, as some of you quite rightly said, is probably best remembered as one of the founding fathers of the United States. And as I was explaining, for some of this Georgian period, America was still part of England. It was one of the colonies. But then actually also during this period, there was the War of Independence, which Franklin became involved in. And America broke away and became independent. And because of his key role in that time, we remember him as a founding father. But he did lots of other things. He started out as a printer and a writer, publishing things like newspapers. And he was also really well known as a scientist. Someone mentioned he invented the glass harmonica, which was a musical instrument. He's probably best known for his lightning rod, though, because he did lots to do with electricity. We've had a few people talking about him being an ambassador. Karen has mentioned that he came and he worked and lived in the UK for 16 years. So you're quite right. That was roughly the period he was living in Benjamin Franklin House, which is the house you can see on the right. And that's the museum that we have today, that's right in the centre of London, around the corner from Trafalgar Square. And he was working there and working as a politician, trying to represent America to the British in Parliament. And he was really trying to find a way forward for America and England to stay together. But eventually he accepted that America was going to need to find its own way. To Georgians to everyone, and then I'll come back to raise hands. Thank you so much for all your participation so far. So, as I mentioned, the reason that we're doing this series is because that was the period that Benjamin Franklin was living in London. So this was the time that he experienced, and some really important events happened that he was involved with as well. So this historical period is really important for us at Benjamin Franklin House. So my first question for you is, why is it called the Georgian period? Some of you have maybe given us some clues about this already. I can see lots of raised hands, which is fantastic. Let me go to Clive again. Hello?
The reason it was called the Georgian period was because there were actually 4 King Georges throughout the Georgian period. So there was George I, George II, George III, the most famous one, and George IV.
That was such a clear explanation. Thank you so much. And you've absolutely got us ready for the next slide. Let's meet the Georges then. Okay, so first of all, we have George I. So he was the first of the Hanoverian kings. So Mark's just mentioned the Tudors, and throughout British history, there are different kind of houses in the monarchy. So you have the Tudors, the Stuarts, the Hanoverians, and then they will happen to most of them be called George, which is why we called it the Georgian period in the end. So this George I was the first of the Hanoverians, and so he came to Britain from Germany, and he ruled for 13 years from 1714 to 1727. So that's the period 1714 is when we think of the Georgian period beginning. And we've got this wonderful, majestic portrait here by Sir Godfrey Kneller, and it's on display in the National Picture Gallery. As I show you each of the Georges, and some of you who joined straight away at the beginning of the class, I was asking you to look at the portraits and see what you notice about them. Because when I've introduced you to them, I'm going to ask what you've noticed and what similarities you see between the portraits, what you think might be happening in them. So then we had George II. So he ruled for 33 years from 1727 to 1760. And so that means that when Benjamin Franklin arrived in London, because he arrived in 1757, George II was on the throne. And then after that, we had George III. So here we have George III, also looking very magnificent. And he was the longest reigning George. So he was king for from 1760 through to 1820. So that was 60 years, so a long time. And then finally we have George IV, who was only king for 10 years, from 1820 to 1830. But then it says he was regent since 1811. Now this is quite important. We're going to come back to it later in the class, why he became regent. But does anyone know already what that means, the fact that he was regent? So lots of raised hands, that's great to see. Let me go to Enid. Hi Enid, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I think that their similarities are they all have very large clothes and all of their leggings look very tight. And they all have long cape thingies.
Right, fantastic. Yes, they've got really grand clothes. The fashions are quite similar. There are some changes between the paintings, but you're right, they have these kind of tights. and they've got very grand clothes. Thank you so much for picking up on those similarities. So if anyone wanted to either tell me what you think regent means or notice some other things about the portraits, I'd love to hear from you. So we've got more raised hands. Let's see someone who hasn't spoken yet. Let's see. Hello there. Is that Bronwyn? Are you there?
Yeah, all the backgrounds are red.
Right, okay, so we've got this quite symbolic colour of red. Thank you so much. Let's see if we can have some more participation. So, and then is it Bartul? Hello?
Is all of the is George the has George the First got a wig on?
He absolutely has. Thank you. They've got wigs on, and Enid was noticing how the fashions were quite similar, but the wigs is something that changes, doesn't it? So you've got the really long wigs at the beginning of the century, and then the style becomes a bit shorter. But it's so great, all of the similarities you're noticing. So as we said, they're very grand, and this was really important. These official portraits, they needed to show how powerful they were so that people would respect them. There are also some objects in the kind of corners of all of the paintings, and this gives you a clue to the special day when these portraits were done. So a special day for kings or queens, and I wonder if anyone has an idea of what those clues might tell us. A few people have said coronation day, or when they were crowned king, and you're quite right. So that's why you've got the crown, the scepter, the orb. So it was the day when they were crowned king. So a really important day, and that's why they've got the particularly grand robes on. Now, regent means that, so one of our participants mentioned that George III sadly suffered from illness, and so wasn't able to really act as king at the end of his reign. So from 1811 until 1820, George IV wasn't officially king, but he was kind of acting as king, so he was regent. So amazed by all the participation so far. I can still see we've still got some raised hand, but I'm going to move on just so that we get through everything I've got planned for you today. But it's so great to see so much participation. Fantastic. So my next question, we're thinking about, you might have noticed that, I'll just go back one. I organised the kings into chronological or time order. And because we're thinking about historical skills, historians, it's really useful for historians to kind of map out history in this chronological order. And so we're going to be thinking what came just before the Georges, and at the end of the class, what came just after. And in doing that, we'll think about all the different royal families that I was wanting to mention as well. So I wonder if anyone knows the kings and queens that ruled just before the Georges, the ones just before. A couple of people, so Leah and Claire, have mentioned that Queen Anne was the queen just before the Georges. You're quite right. And someone has preempted my question later, which is going to be who came next. No. We've talked a bit about who came before. When I show you some images of those of Anne and also the king and queen that came before her, I'm going to show you also a special diagram that historians use to help them think about the order of history. It's really useful. Does anyone know what that's called? So it will have the different dates and the different things that happened. Really important for historians, and that's one of the skills we're thinking about today. Hi, Enid.
Hi, it's a timeline.
A timeline, exactly. Thank you so much. So the main historical skill we're thinking about today is that chronological ordering. Because as you'll see, we have a thing with kings and queens is there's lots of names that repeat themselves. I mean, we've got these 4 Georges, and so timelines can really help us get that in order. So let me show you those kings and queens that came before the Georgian period. So lots of people have talked about the Tudors and the Stuarts, and here we have a really helpful timeline. So this timeline is vertical, going sort of from the top to the bottom, but we sometimes see them horizontal as well, going from side to side. And you can see that the different kind of houses or different families within the monarchy are colour-coded. So Tudors have been mentioned. They're the ones that are this kind of light purple colour. So people like Henry VIII and Elizabeth. And then the Stuarts were this turquoise colour, and they came just before the Georgians. And now during the Stuarts' reign, there was lots of big events that happened. There was the Civil War, and for a short period, there was the Commonwealth where there was no king. So lots happening. And then just before the Georgians, we had these rulers. So William III and Mary II. And then, as some people mentioned in the chat, Anne was the last of the Stuarts. So lots of people have mentioned timeline. Fantastic. So now we've met the Georges and thought about who came before them. Let's find out a bit more about each one, okay? So first of all, we've got George I. So here he is. You can see his portrait a bit more clearly. So let's think about his family. Now remember, he came over from Hanover, and he had been married to someone called Sophia Dorothea, but they got divorced quite a long time before he became king. And they had a son, George, and daughter Sophia. Sophia. So named after themselves. And when he came to London, his half sister came with him, and she was also called Sophia. So this is one of the reasons that things like timelines are so helpful for us to organise historical information, because there was so much to remember, and all these repeated names. So that's why they're so helpful. Let's think a bit about his personality. So he was not that happy to be king. He'd been brought in because we've mentioned the Stuarts, and during the Stuarts there had been some difficulty because there had been a Catholic king, James II, whereas most of the English kings were Protestant, and that had not gone down very well. So it was really important to continue having these Protestant kings, which is why George I became king. But he spent a lot of his time going back to Hanover, and that meant that his subjects, the British people, didn't really think a lot of him either. So there was that kind of difficulty. And then some of the key events that happened. So just at the beginning of his reign, there was a Jacobite Rising. So this is people who still thought that the Stuart family should be ruling rather than the Hanover family. So there was a rising to try and overthrow George. So a difficult start to his reign. In 1720, there was something called the South Sea Bubble. So it was like a financial crisis. So people lost their fortunes. And then in 1721, so Robert Walpole moved. He got to live in 10 Downing Street, and although he actually went by the name, what was his title? He went by Screen Master General. Now we kind of think of him as the first Prime Minister. So those were the important events from that time. To George II. Right, so here he is, and he was married to Queen Caroline, and they had 7 children together. What was his personality like? So remember, his father, George I, had divorced his mother, and actually that was when George II was quite young, and he didn't get to see her again. So I think that was probably quite hard for him. And so he could be quite bad-tempered and preferred being alone, but his wife was very cultural and intellectual, and she played a really important role at court, which is where people would come and see the king and queen. But he was, in fact, the last British monarch to lead his troops into battle, and so he was seen as brave because of this. And we can see in the key events that there were quite a few battles and wars during this time. So in 1739, there was a naval war, so with boats against the Spanish. And then from 1740 to 48, the War of Austrian Succession. That's the war that George II went into battle for. And then in 1745, there was another Jacobite Rising. So again, people trying to get the Stuart family back on the throne. And that was finally defeated the next year in 1746. And then an important event for us at Benjamin Franklin House, and one of the reasons, something that would have really affected Benjamin Franklin when he was in England, and then also eventually one of the reasons that there was the American Revolution, was there was this 7 Years' War. So Britain was fighting other European countries to see who could have control over those colonies in America, and it cost a lot of money. And then they needed to, they asked Americans to pay a lot more tax. And this is one of the many reasons that we went on to have the American Revolution, or the War of Independence. Someone has asked about whether Benjamin Franklin was friends with the kings. He wasn't friends with the kings. And in fact, George III was someone that, you know, the Americans were quite cross with because they saw him as, you know, introducing things that they didn't agree with. So let's go on to George III as we're talking about it. So he wasn't actually George II's son. He was the son of George II's son, Frederick, who died quite young. And he was married to Queen Charlotte, and they had 13 children, if you can believe it. So he was cultured, he had lots of interest in the arts and the sciences as well. But as some people have mentioned already, his reign was sadly overshadowed by his health. So he had bouts of mental illness. And so that kind of manifested itself. He could be quite controlling of his children and also the countries he ruled, and we'll see how that played itself out. So lots of key events in his reign. I mean, it was a long reign, 60 years. So this is kind of when there were lots of wars, but also the Industrial Revolution was starting. So we started to have things like the steam engine that James Watt developed in 1764. And then in 1771, Richard Arkwright built the first successful water-powered cotton mill. So starting to get those factories and being able to produce things more quickly. Then, as we've mentioned, during his reign, there was the American War of Independence, or the American Revolutionary War, and that was from 1775 to 1783. And that was why Franklin left in 1775. And he became one of the founding fathers. After that, there were then the Napoleonic Wars, so that was against France. And at the end of his reign, England abolished the slave trade, although not slavery itself yet. So lots of really important things happening in that reign. Before we go on to the final George, I'll just see if there were any comments or questions. So someone has mentioned about taxes, there being an issue with the tea trade. So another key event that I didn't include because of space, which was in the run-up to the American War of Independence, was the Boston Tea Party, where lots of tea was thrown into the water at Harbour, at Boston. And I can see some raised hands as well. Let me go to Mark's. Hello.
Hello. Do you know why they wore wigs?
So I think it was just because it was the fashion. So that was why they wanted to wear them. But the fashions did change a bit, and they had to powder them too. So very different to what we know today. And I'll come back to more questions when we've got through to the last George. So let's see. Here we go, George IV. So George IV had a brief marriage to Queen Caroline. So you can see we've had lots of repeated names again, and they only had one daughter called Charlotte, another repeated name, who sadly died when she was quite young at 21. So I think George IV was mentioned right at the beginning, and he was a really extravagant personality. He loved having parties and buying expensive things, expensive clothes. But unfortunately, this quite excessive lifestyle where he ate a lot and drank a lot meant that he had health problems. So things like his arteries thickening, and in later life, he actually had to have a lot of painkillers to help with that. So it had its shortcomings, that kind of extravagance. And then some important things that were happening: the first railway in 1825 in the north of England. And then we mentioned there'd been this conflict about Catholics and Protestants, and because of that, there had been lots of restrictions for Catholics. They weren't allowed to do things like go to university and have certain jobs, but in 1829, that stopped. And also in 1829, Robert Peel founded the police service. So for most of the Georgian period, remember it ends in 1830, there was no official police service. And in a later class, we're going to be thinking about crime and punishment in the period. So it'll be interesting to think about how that worked then. Fantastic. So I just see if we've got some more hands. Let me go to 5. Hello.
I was just wondering, why did George IV die?
Well, why did he die?
Was it because of his health, or was it just because of something else?
Yes, so his health definitely affected it. So he was, in fact, all of the Georges lived to quite a good age for the period. So George I was 67 when he died. George II was 76. George III was 81, and George IV was 67. So for that period, they lived quite good lives. Of course, they had lots of the best doctors and the best medicines. But yes, because of all that excessive living, it had caused these health problems that eventually led to his death. Thank you for your question. And I'll just go to a couple more raised hands, and then let me go to Phoebe. Hello.
Hello. Why did George the Fourth like having lots of parties?
That's a great question. That was kind of just his personality. He loved beautiful things. He was a great collector of art and very special objects. And so it was just part of his personality. And maybe it was something to do with having been kind of a king in waiting for quite a long time. Remember, he was regent from 1811 until 1820, so 9 years. And then maybe when he finally became the full king, he kind of maybe took it quite far and wanted to have control over all of these things. Great question though, and let me go to Enid as well. Hi Enid.
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah.
Why did King George go mad?
Why did he go mad?
No, King George the Third go mad. Why did King George the Third go mad?
Yeah, so I don't think we know exactly. It was just a health issue that he had, and it unfortunately that he just really wasn't very well, and it was quite hidden at the time. So we don't know exactly why it happened. It was just a health condition that he had, sadly. Thanks for great. Okay, and there were some great questions in the chat too. So someone asked, how did King George react to losing American independence? Well, not very well. It was a great loss to England, so that he wouldn't have reacted very well. And what kind of pain relief would have been available? So we haven't currently got a session planned on medicine in the Georgian period, but that may be one for the future. I think it would have been really strong things like laudanum and opium as well. And someone's asked how much longer. So yes, I'm sorry, I did say that this would be half an hour, but we've had so much amazing participation that it's been 45 minutes. We're very nearly at the end, I think just a couple more minutes. So my last question for you is, who ruled Britain after the Georges? Now, someone already answered this in the chat. So let me go back up to find who that was. Let me find, can I find it? So Georgia said a little while ago that Victorians came after the Georgian era. You're quite right. So let's look at, they were still part of the Hanoverian family, but we'll see who was the Victorians. So straight after George IV, we had William IV. Now we mentioned how George IV didn't have any children. So William was actually a younger son of George III, so brother to George IV. And sadly, he didn't. He had 2 children. They died when they were children. And then after him, his niece Victoria came to the throne and reigned for a very long time. And we call that period, she reigned the Victorian period, although she was still part of the Hanoverian family. And she was Britain's longest reigning monarch until our current Queen, Elizabeth II. I see some comments in the chat. Brilliant. And some people knew that it was William IV before Queen Victoria. Fantastic. Brilliant. So we've very nearly come to the end of the session. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and I wanted to show you an idea for an activity you could go and do if you wanted to kind of build on and consolidate what we've learned today. So let me stop sharing, and then I see there are more questions, so I'll come to those as well. So my idea, we've talked a lot about, we've kind of set the scene for the Georgian period by talking about the kings and their queens and the children that they had, and also those key events that were happening. So what I suggest, and we also spoke about that historical skill of thinking about things in chronological order, and we introduced that diagram we call a timeline that can be so helpful for that. So if you would like to do an activity following on from this class, I suggest that maybe you could do a timeline of the Georgian period in Britain. So I'll show you an example that I started earlier. So you just need a piece of paper, a ruler. You could just use a pencil or some pens. I've used colours to help me see the different time periods. So I've got my line. You could do it this way, or you could do it that way, like we saw before. And I put in the key dates with the different Georges at the bottom. And then I started putting in some key events. So for the moment, I've just put the date that Benjamin Franklin arrived in London and when he left. But we saw lots more important events that you could add as well. So if you are interested in trying an activity after the class, then that's what I would suggest.